Hey guys, good morning. There was a lot of stuff going on with the video the other day, and I kind of want to clarify more of the position, because I understand that Maduro and his regime was not a good regime at all, but I don't think that that is really something that is so much cared about by the United States government. I think that's just an excuse for them to push in to get what they want and to get our corporations what they want. Case in point, like he's talking about taking aim at Mexico for the drug cartel problem and stuff. But if you really wanted to solve that issue, you could solve three issues at the same time, right? By bringing our troops home from overseas, and bringing the intelligence apparatus home from overseas, that are especially the ones in Eastern Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, that are causing all the stuff, and there's all the bullshit going on with those wars. Bring those guys home, right? And put our troops on our borders and in our ports instead of overseas and spending billions and billions and billions on a weekly basis to keep our troops over there doing all of this ridiculous hegemonic practices. That's how you could really solve this problem. And you would need to lock down the CIA and the DEA, right? The CIA is integral. They were integral, along with organized crime and certain rogue factions within the government system of the USA and Israel, for that matter, and the UK. Like, they were integral in helping create the cartels of Latin America, from the very bottom all the way up to Mexico, right? The cartels would not exist as they do today without the support of the CIA. All right? And going into the late 80s, early 90s, like the creation of the DEA. And I mean, case in point, just recently was the head of the DEA under Obama that was just arrested for working with the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the new generation Jalisco cartel. Right? All the history with the School of the Americas. If you don't know about the School of the Americas, you need to look that up. That's where the Los Zetas came from. All right, they came and trained as like an anti-cartel unit to track down the cartels, and then they just went into Mexico, and I believe it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and they just took over the game with severe violence, and it had severe consequences for the populace of Mexico. Lots of violence, lots of increased drug trafficking. And the militant wing of Jalisco Nueva Generación, of the cartel with the most power right now, like the military wing, a lot of that is led by ex-US Special Forces, right? It's crazy stuff. So my point of view is, like, if you truly wanted to stop this, then you would bring our troops home, put them on the border and the ports. It would solve a lot of our economic issues, because we wouldn't be spending billions overseas for these hegemony practices as Israel's bitch, and the bitch of corporations and major banks, right? You bring them home, put them on our ports and borders, and you would lock shit down. All right, you would go into these parts of California and Colorado and other places in the U.S. where the cartels have taken over very large areas, especially concerning like the marijuana growth, and them taking over the legal growers and stuff, taking over their operations, and you would get them out. You would use our troops and our National Guard to do that. You would not be supporting the CIA, Trump. You would not be supporting the CIA and the shit that they do. They should be disbanded completely for all the shit they've done. Their history is one of it's a history that's horrible. And it's not just the drug trafficking, which has been going on like over 70 years, right? Almost 80 years. The CIA has been trafficking drugs, right? Continuously. And usually that stuff is used to fund all these black budget and deep state projects that are ruining the world. So again, like, pointing at Venezuela as narco terrorists is just it's just insane. If you're not saying the same thing about Colombia and Ecuador, I mean, you are saying the same thing about Mexico, right? And that's a much bigger hit than Venezuela. That rings a lot more true. Being said, I don't consider it a terrorist state because it was this whole practice, the whole system of the cartels and the drug trafficking. It was created in tandem under direction of U.S. intelligence and organized crime services working together with them, right? This stuff can be traced all the way back to Prohibition, at least. With like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and the organized crime sector, who had all the dirt on Edgar Hoover and the FBI, which gave them a pass for everything. And Lansky and Luciano, they also worked with the OSS. It was the group that became the CIA during World War II, right? They depended on organized crime to get the proper intel on the Germans and the Italians that could touch America on American soil, and also intel overseas in those areas during the war. And because of that, it pretty much made Meyer Lansky untouchable. That, and because they had the photographs of Clyde Tolson and Hoover having sex, and they had blackmail on everybody, and that's how they got to the top. No one messed with those guys because they weren't just organized crime. They were highly involved with intelligence and law enforcement and military. They were untouchable. It's kind of how you see like the Clintons now. They can rape teenage girls and all this other shit and get away with it, even though everybody knows about it because of their power. And it's just bonkers. So if it was truly the goal of stopping drugs coming into America, it wouldn't be going in and taking over other nations. It would be locking down our borders, our security extra tight, and putting our troops all along it to stop all this madness. Getting the people who've already infiltrated out, focusing on getting the people who've infiltrated major areas in the U.S. out, from California up to Washington State, all the way to Colorado, God knows where else. Like, it would be forcing, it would be going after those guys and getting them out of the U.S. and then blocking up the border so no more could come in. But that's not happening. And it's not happening because it's not the goal. That's not the goal of our foreign policy. The goal of our foreign policy is to take over and create an imperialistic hegemony. Now that's not going to happen in the Eastern Hemisphere. It will not be allowed by China and Russia. And he's kind of shifting that. I think that's what's happening. She's kind of shifting it over to try to get a complete lockdown in the Western Hemisphere. Hence, now while he's going after Venezuela and likely in the future Mexico, by the way he's talking now. But if that happens, like that's also gonna be very, very dire for the U.S. because so much of our manufacturing and food comes from Mexico and Latin America, right? Cars, power tools, things like that. I mean, pretty much the only thing that the U.S. manufactures itself now are weapons. I mean, that's what it comes down to on a large scale. So he's playing the game for the warmongers, right? And all these leaders across the world, right? The Macrons, those people in charge of Germany and Spain and the UK, certain African nations, and most of Europe, obviously, like they are playing the world government game. And all this stuff is causing infighting between everybody in the US and Europe, for that matter, to tear these countries apart. And then once chaos utterly breaks out, then they want to come in as the heroes and say, this system isn't working. We have to form some kind of global governance system based on or ran around our high technocratic tracking system, our technocratic fascist tracking system that they've been physically building up since 9/11, right? And anybody that just has put 9/11 and all that stuff in the wind and let it fly, if you believe the narrative, I mean, it really only takes an hour to really look at it and figure it out. I mean, all of the Freedom of Information Act requests that have brought out so much of the information, I mean, it's available just to look at on the internet from great researchers. And you can go back and verify it very easily and track this stuff back, right? And it's crazy. Like, we use 9/11 to build a security system that is weaponized against the United States. The fucking TSA has never caught a terrorist before, all right? They weren't created to catch terrorists. They were created to control us, to control the American populace. It's what it comes down to. Same thing with like Palantir and OpenAI and Google and all these stuff. All these guys, you can trace all this stuff back to being CIA and DARPA creations to be weaponized against the American people. Just like the SV40 virus back in the 50s that the CIA injected into, I think it was like 100,000 people, and now pretty much everybody in America has it. And since then, what has happened? You know, cancer, diabetes, all neurological issues, all this stuff that was like almost non-existent skyrocketed, and it gets worse and worse and worse every year. The vaccine schedule, after they start that in the mid-'80s, same thing happens. Autism, diabetes, all kinds of neurological and autoimmune issues, all this stuff. It's like there is a long-term plan of these things happening, and you have, if you really want to understand what's going on, you have to see it past that. It's not just some random people randomly happening things that from terrorists that, like, no, I'm sorry. Bin Laden didn't do 9/11 in a cave in Afghanistan. Afghanistan and Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, right? And those countries are obliterated from this stuff. And from that, you know, that came the excuse to also go after Libya, Yemen, Iran, and all this other stuff that's happening right now. And it was for global hegemonic purposes. And, I mean, let's face it, 9/11 was U.S. and Israeli intelligence working together with Saudi Arabia. All the pilots were from Saudi Arabia. Why haven't we blown them to shit? Right? Because it was a false flag designed to keep us in a war, or to put us in war, that never-ending war, and eventually be used to encircle us with this system of security to make the American people safe. And all it's been used for is to trap us in a high technocratic prison, right? The same thing went on in Europe. And you have to see like the history and go back to their documentation about these kind of things. The one about all the shit in the Middle East happening, that was from the Pentagon directly after the Cold War ended. I think it was 91, maybe 92. And that's where the idea and the whole terminology of full spectrum dominance occurred, right? These are decades long plans. And I know it seems like it's kind of getting off subject, but it's not. It all ties together with the cartels, right? Because it's the same groups and organizations that have been doing this. George Herbert Walker Bush and his father Prescott Bush were all involved in this kind of stuff. I mean, it's so crazy and it's so hard to put everything together. But if you wanted just to go and do it yourself, that would just be a lifetime of research where you're researching this for hours and hours every day. But luckily, there's all kinds of great researchers you can go to, and all you have to do is verify what they say and find where this documentation is. It becomes much easier and a much shorter process. But so for me, I'm coming from a perspective of anti-war, and this administration, the CIA, NSA, the rogue people in the military, the warmongers, the weapons companies, big banks, even the pharmaceutical companies, right? The cabal, whatever, the globalist elite, whatever you want to call them, this group, Epstein Network, Iran-Contra Network, Franklin Scandal Network, 9/11 Network. There are interconnections in the same people in these groups across the board, dozens of them. It includes leaders and former leaders of all kinds of nations, right? United States, Israel, the UK, across the board, Saudi Arabia. I don't know if I said Israel, but obviously Israel. These guys are going for a global dominating system that is ruled by a new type of like technocratic fascist serfdom. And that is their goal. That is their full spectrum dominance goal. That's what they're going to. And you can't separate the CIA and the MI6 and the Mossad, French and German and Italian intelligence, all those intelligence, you can't separate those guys anymore. It is one big web now. It's been one big web for a while. And all the stuff with this web from Epstein, like when you pull that string, that's when it really starts to show, right? And that's what, if you really want to understand stuff, you have to come from a historical perspective, and you have to look at the dirt. You can't just ignore the bad stuff that the United States has been involved in. You have to look at the history that they're trying to suppress in order to actually understand what is going on. And so, coming from that lens, with that historical understanding of things, when you see us going into Venezuela to do this, off of mostly false premises, calling it narco-terrorism and arms trafficking and all that stuff, for a regime that we've been trying to take over since before Maduro, since at least Bush Jr. was in office. There have been plans to take over Venezuela. Like, from that perspective, it's pretty easy to see what's going on. And I mean, what is this going to lead to? What happens if Russia and China don't just send arms and aid to Venezuela, and they get involved militarily, right? God, the warmongers would love that. They would love that, because that would be their fulcrum to push us into the new society that they want to build, where we're all going to be serfs. You know, the whole idea, like the smart 15-minute cities and all that crazy shit going on, that forcing us into vaccines, right? The whole Neuralink thing, and connecting our brains directly to artificial intelligence and quantum computing and all that stuff. Like, all that taps in together. And I know it sounds nuts, but it's actually there if you look for it. And I would suggest reading works from Whitney Webb and Ryan Dawson to get full pictures of this stuff. But there's so other many, especially like Max Blumenthal with the Gray Zone, right? If you think that Venezuela is going to be a better country because of this, then just go back a few years and look at what happened to Libya, all right? They're saying all this bad stuff about Gaddafi, whatever they want to say. You got to remember, he was American educated, and he went into his country as a patriot for Libya. He was a real patriot for Libya, and he was going to transform Africa, right? And it wasn't just I think they were going to call it the Africano, having their own gold-backed currency of Africa, like the euro, except backed by gold. He was also had these excellent plans that was going to fertilize a huge part of the Sahara Desert and stop a lot of the desertification that is occurring, because the people there have to chop wood for their fire, for their energy. They have to chop down a lot of their forest. And he was going to make Africa and all the nations there completely independent of the need of Western civilization and our money. And that was a big no-no. That was a big no-no. And current evidence of that is all the stuff going on with the North and Western countries in France right now, who's been trying to extract their gold. And then all the nations, it's like half are for NATO, and half the nations in Africa are with NATO, and half are with the Eastern Bloc, Russia, China. You can look at Burkina Faso and all the stuff that's been happening right there, right now. And I commend that leader. I commend him for the stuff that he's been doing. Kicking out these major corporations that are extracting all their resources, while their nation's people are starving to death and and fighting in these useless civil wars that are predicated by Western governments and Western intelligence. That is what has been happening for like 100 years and continues to happen right now. That is just history, right? So look at Libya. After we went in, we destroy Gaddafi. We completely obliterate their chance to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, which is what they were doing. And now it's a war-torn country that has an open slave market. All right? It has an open slave market. You can buy a human being there for like $300. All right? We did that to Libya. We could have been working with Gaddafi and making Africa a great, powerful nation that with the resources that would have helped spread peace, right? Because it would have benefited everybody there. No one would have been fighting over who controls the food plots if everybody's getting fed, right? And everybody's working together. And everybody's getting enough to invest in their own nations and to pull themselves up by the bootstrap, build up their infrastructure and their social systems. But that didn't happen. We wanted those resources. We wanted control politically and economically those places. So a ruler that is going against that, they're going to get murdered. And that is just the history of our foreign policy in the U.S. and the West in general, of the EU, NATO. That is just the general foreign policy that we have stuck to, and has been happening since World War I. Right? And that can go back, and we can go back and start thinking like the robber barons and like the Rothschild family, that like the huge banking families out of Europe, Rothschilds, Warburgs, all those guys, for kind of setting up that system, um, to push more of like the European, um, imperialism style of foreign policy. Um, it's when it really started to kick off in more of like the modern industrial age, right? So try to see through a lens, uh, um, of the historical backgrounds and the players that have been doing this, right? And their desires and their wants, and the history of these political and business and banking families, um, and how they have formed and created our society, our school system, our medical system, our military, research, systems, and our military goals, our intelligence systems, right? Um, if you can see that in that historical lens and come from a point of peace and anti-war, um, then it's really easy to see how fucking crazy it is right now what we're doing in Venezuela. And you can see how crazy it is, everything that we've been doing in Africa and Southeast Asia, all of Latin America, for the last 100 years. Like it's absolutely crazy. um you want to, like, let's name off some other countries in Latin America that we've been overthrown, and put our governments in, and see how they fared, huh? Honduras. How about Honduras? Nicaragua, El Salvador. Thank God the new president of Salvador has been like pushing this shit off, and making his own way with his own country. But before him, it was terrible, right? Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Haiti, uh, Jamaica, Cuba, Colombia, Panama, uh, Chile, Argentina, um, let's see, not so much, some other guys too, but not so heavy. Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, not as heavy as these other guys. But, I mean, there's not a nation in Latin America that we haven't overthrown at some point, for some reason. All tracing back to the desires of corporations through U.S. foreign policy, right? Every country that we've gone in militarily for a regime change has been devastated and put back decades and decades and decades. And if you think that it's going to be any different in Venezuela, like, give me some historical record where things have changed for the positive, then, please. In any nation in Latin America, Asia, or Southeast Asia, or Africa, any of them. Show me any nation that has benefited in any way, and has not been set back decades, and has not been absolutely devastated by U.S. foreign policy and regime change through our foreign policy for the desires of intelligence corporations and political families, right? Show me any nation that has done better after we've gone in there. And we can have a real discussion of if there's actual merit in Venezuela and what we're doing in Venezuela or not. And if there's any merit of any kind of idea of doing the same kind of thing in Mexico, right? There is no historical background to show anything positive coming out of this. Everything shows devastation and imperialistic practices that end up starving out and destroying the people of the nation that were pulling the regime change in. Every single one of them. There's not a single one that has had any positive effects, right? We put our puppet governments in. A lot of times, it's dictators that we want in instead of the dictators that are ruling. So, and the whole Iran-Contra scandal is about that, right? It's to fight communism. Okay, then why did we create a drug trafficking network that created the entire crack cocaine epidemic in the United States? Then we flood the inner cities with arms, and create a huge private prison system this huge prison system in order to put the drug offenders in, while the CIA is controlling the narrative in pop culture, especially in hip-hop and the rise of hip-hop, in order to push these narratives like you have to sell crack to get by, right? That's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. And to say it is, it's kind of madness. So if you look at it through these perspectives, it's really easy to see what's going on. Another good one is, what about Trujillo in the Dominican Republic? He was a dictator that, I think it was Nixon, maybe, or somebody, one of the presidents said, yes, he's a bastard, but he's our bastard. And look at the vicious shit that happened under his regime, and all the terrible things that have led to that. And the Dominican Republic, they've never recovered from that, and it's still hard for them. So again, I'm coming from this on a perspective of understanding the historical backgrounds, one, that's coming from this, and coming from a perspective that of anti-war, like a historical lens with the perspective of anti-war. And I think we're just going about it all wrong, and I think this is causing division and arguments between us to keep us divided, instead of looking at the real problems, right? Who are the real networks that are doing this? Who is pushing the narrative in the media? Why are they doing this? Right? Why do they keep us fighting over technology that's over a century old, and that's super pollution, right? They don't want us to unify in any mean. Those are the biggest things that the Western nations and intelligence, militaries, governments, blah, 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 our corporations, the biggest things that they're doing is they're keeping vital information from us as much as they can, that would empower us, and that would take power away from them, that would get them in major trouble, right? Epstein, 9/11, Iran-Contra, Franklin scandal, all those guys, like, and it keeps going back, it keeps going back, right? They're keeping vital information about us. They're suppressing the technology that would completely decentralize the power of all the centralized governments, and bring energy and abundance to the entire world. They're preventing the decentralization of their power through the release of highly advanced energy and propulsion technologies, right? And that, I think, and consciousness too, they're keeping us from attaining higher levels of spirituality and consciousness, and that even goes above the secret energy and propulsion programs, right? Because when you get to those levels, right, and we see people that are able to do this, and these deep meditations and all this new stuff that's coming true, right? We see these people that are able to see outside of like physical documentation, and through like the lens of what the ancients would call like the Akashic records, right? Remote viewing is real. If it wasn't real, the CIA wouldn't have been spending billions of dollars on it through the last centuries. They wouldn't have had the program at the Stanford Research Institute under Russell Targ, and they wouldn't have had over an 85% success rate, right? And they use those remote viewers they prevented nuclear war between us and Russia probably 2 or 3 times with those remote viewers, right? On top of that, they were able to short the silver market in the mid-80s, I want to say, and over a course of like a month or two, make $250,000 by seeing the stock market in the future, right? We have the new stuff coming out about like the telepathy tapes, and if you haven't seen that, like those are real psychologists doing these tests, and highly scientific method, like following that scientific method to a T, double blinds and everything. The first part of them is recorded audioly. The second part they're doing on camera, which they just released. This stuff it's real, and we all have these abilities to do this stuff through prayer, through meditation, right? Through rising our spiritual and our conscious awareness, right? And it's those things that the governments, the intelligence, the rogue military factions across the globe, especially in Western civilizations, but also in Russia and China and these guys, this stuff they do not want to come out. They are fighting tooth and nail to keep it from coming out and to keeping us from unifying, right? Unifying as a population across the world, or even in a country, and even in a single country. They want division. They do not want the people to unify over our common issues. They do not want us to have these technologies that would solve the world problems and completely destroy their pyramidal power grid. And they do not want us to raise our spiritual and conscious awareness and to become more unified as a species across the globe. Those are the three major themes, the three major things that all these wars and distractions are really hiding. That's what's really being hidden, right? If we can kind of look back, and instead of looking at everything from here, right? If we can come and look at the perspective from a higher point of view and a higher perspective, it's pretty easy to see what is happening. And when enough people do see what is happening, that's when major change will come. That's when major change will come. And that's why I've said yesterday and again today, like, we need a spiritual and a conscious evolution across humanity. And it's not just Western. That is also in Russia and China, all of Europe, all of Asia, all of Africa, all of the Middle East. We need a spiritual and conscious unification, or they're just going to keep getting worse. And we're going to end up in some crazy-ass World War III scenario, whether it comes through the pressure and all the stuff that's happening in the Middle East, especially concerning Iran right now, or if it comes through Latin America and Venezuela. Well, I don't know how it's going to come, but I do know if we keep on this path, it is coming. There's no stopping it coming if we can't sit down and talk with one another, right? We figure out our common goals. Don't worry about what we disagree with, right? With each other. We need to sit down, have talks with one another, figure out our common goals and what we all want and need, figure out a way to work towards those common goals together, and then start doing it. The world will change dramatically at an extremely rapid pace if that happens, right? Unifying over common needs and goals on a global level, forcing the release of these high technologies. And if, Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Skunk Works, DARPA, the CIA, all those guys that have been NSA, they've been suppressing it. They don't want it out. They won't push it out. Then we bring our own scientists and our own people together and say, we're making this, right? And we don't put it under some big corporation and make them like the new Rockefellers of energy. You open source it. You push it out to every single scientific and university institution across the world and say, remake this and spread it across the globe, right? 2, that would be how we solve the energy crisis, the pollution crisis, the hunger crisis, and it would create abundance across the world, right? So, a conscious spiritual unification between people, the spreading of technology, and forget my third point, but you get it. the three things I listed earlier. Bring those three together and just talk with one another. See things from a historical perspective through the lens of peace and prosperity. And if you can wrap that around your head and start working with your local community about this stuff, like, amazing things will happen in a short period of time. And for those of us lucky enough to have family and kids, you will create a paradise for them. They will be living in a paradise in the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, and those are two options, right? We have spiritual and conscious awakening and paradise, or the status quo, division, global war, and a technocratic fascist serfdom where we're all entrapped through a technocratic system. Like, those are the two paths that we get to choose from right now. Those are the paths that we get to choose, that, right? And the only way to make a good choice about this and to go on a path of peace and prosperity for all is to drop the differences, notice what's being used as distractions, see what the real things are that they don't want us to have, which is, right, unifying over common goals, bringing out these technologies, and God damn it, why can't I think of the third point? But having collaboration and cooperation, right? Bringing in a spiritual and conscious awakening. We put these objectives together, and we will be living in a paradise instead of the madness that's happening right now. And it all connects, right? So that's the point I'm coming at. So the shit in Venezuela that's happening right now, it is the wrong way to go. You know, it's the wrong way to go. And if Trump really wanted to stop the drugs coming in, he would check the CIA and the rogue military factions doing this. He would put the CIA under fucking lockdown. He would bring our troops home, stop spending billions overseas that's bankrupting the United States, put all of our troops around the borders and ports, make those extra secure, and he would push for peace through diplomacy and through the release of the necessary information and the release of technology. If Trump really wanted to make a difference and change the status quo, then he wouldn't be following the steps of the fucking status quo. He'd be doing things more like what I just explained. So that's my perspective on things. I've been studying history, international relations, and current events for 16 years now, almost 20 years. On an obsessive, diehard level for hours and hours a day. And I know what I'm talking about. I know a lot of the stuff that's going on. However weird some of it seems, it can be verified. And look it up yourself, right? Go check, even if it's just one of the subjects. Just go look up one thing. And if I'm wrong, point it out, correct me, and I'll go look and verify to see if the correction is real or not, right? Not above that. Let's talk, figure this shit out. But we've got to stop the status quo of our foreign policy, and the problems it's creating around the world, because that is the issue. Do not be distracted from the real things that we need to focus on. The distractions are the wars that they're pushing, right? Why is Epstein's not being talked about? All that stuff right now because of Venezuela. And if you think that's an accident, then I think you're out of your mind, right? See the distractions, see what the real problems are, and look for solutions. And then talk together about how we can resolve these issues. That is the way to go about it, in my humble opinion. I hope this was informative and helpful. I love everybody. Please share the video if you like, or go check out the other stuff I have on YouTube about things. And if there's anything that I missed or that I got incorrect, I'd love to talk about it with you and figure out what it is. Have a good one.